Marcy and I were a part of CCLF's original youth group in our late grade 11 year, grade 12 year, and we were sold out for Jesus. I mean, we were wrecked for the ordinary. We just wanted to serve Jesus no matter what we did. And man, we'd preach to our teachers and students and all that stuff. And well, in our grade, toward our grade 12 year, we would meet once or twice a week in a little church downtown, and we'd get on our knees at 7:30 in the morning before school, and we would pray that God would move in revival like never before. And you know what? In our grade 12 graduation class, we had an outreach effort with a youth evangelist, and our entire graduation class pretty much came out to that. And many of them walked the aisle to give their lives to the Lord, and some of them stuck and some of them didn't, but we're still seeing results actually, even in recent weeks. Somebody who had given their life to the Lord back then. Well, I love revival, always have, just as I surrender to the Lord, seeing God move in extraordinary ways that only He can get credit for. I had researched so much about revival in the Hebrides, particularly off the west coast of Scotland, where God moved in an incredible way from 1949 to 1952. And Scotland itself had seen many, many revivals, and Marcy and I were going there. Surprise to us, but we were going there. Long story there, but to be part of a ministry team to inner city kids in a place called Annie's Land, in a little church in the slums of Glasgow. And I had researched revival. Oh, I longed to bring it, particularly I had read the story of Reverend Duncan Campbell, who had been summoned to the Isle of Hebrides, to this little town, village, or region, the parish of Barvis, and to preach a special effort. And he said, "No, I'm not the man. I'm not the man. I don't want to do this." And he was doing his own thing in Glasgow at the time, or actually I think he was up in Edinburgh. And but he said it was decided, and he would come. It was decided he would come for 10 days, and within 10 days he had got there. And I remember reading that an awareness of God had already gripped the community, an awareness of eternal realities. And the first night, what had happened was the minister of this church and I think a couple of his deacons, who Duncan Campbell had never met before, met him at the boat, and they basically said, what I have it written down here: "I know, Mr. Campbell, that you are very tired. You've been traveling all day by train to begin with, and then by steamer. And I'm sure that you are ready for your supper and ready for bed. But I wonder if you could be prepared to address a meeting in the parish church at 9 p.m. tonight on our way home. It will be a short meeting, and then we'll make for the manse, and you'll get your supper and your bed and your rest until tomorrow morning." Well, that supper never came. About 300 people had gathered for this 9 o'clock service, and he gave an address, and he said nothing much special really happened. It just sort of was an ordinary meeting. The presence of God was there. He felt the awareness of the Holy Spirit, but nothing out of the ordinary, really. And he said that as he was closing the meeting, he gave the benediction, and he was walking down the aisle when all of a sudden this young deacon, 24 years old, I think, maybe even younger, he had suddenly stood up in the aisle, and looking up to the heavens, he said, "God, oh God, you can't fail us. You can't fail us. You promised to pour water on the dry ground, oh God. You can't fail us." And so all of a sudden he drops to his knees and he's praying. And then he kind of just topples over onto the floor. And just then the door opens at the back of the church, and the local blacksmith is there. He comes back, he goes, "Mr. Campbell, something wonderful has happened. Oh, we are praying that God would pour water on the thirsty and floods upon the dry ground. And listen, he's done it. He's done it." Duncan Campbell said, "When I went to the door of the church, I saw a congregation of approximately 600 people outside. 600 people. Where did they come from? What had happened?" Well, what had happened was over 100 people were at the dance hall. It was actually a parish hall. They were at a dance. And they were not thinking anything about God at all. God was not at all on their minds or eternity. And they were there just to have a good time. And suddenly the power of God fell upon the dance. The music ceased. And in a matter of minutes, the hall was empty. And these people, these young people, fled from the hall, as Duncan Campbell said, as one would flee a plague. And they made for the church. And they're now standing outside, and more gathered. And they saw lights in the church. That was a house of God. And they were gonna go to it, and they went. And men and women who had gone to bed rose, dressed, and made for the church as well. Nothing in the way of publicity had happened, except they had said that a man was going to come and hold some meetings for 10 days, but that was about it. But God took the situation in hand. God became his own publicity director. God was moving. A hunger and a thirst came upon these people. 600 of them. 600 at the church, standing outside, waiting to be preached at. There are other stories of criminals coming to the police station and confessing their sins, and they would call on Mr. Campbell to come and talk to them. Fast forward now 51 years, year 2000, Marcy and I arrive in Scotland. I'm already a little bit just amped up for this. I'm reading all this kind of stuff, right, on the plane. We end up at this little white Elim Pentecostal church in the downtown of Glasgow. We go into the little church with the team. People are walking around. Our leader is talking with the pastor there. I walk around. I go up to the pulpit. The whole place is probably about the size of our little ministry center called The Rock. And there's a little stage and a single pulpit, and I stand behind the pulpit. And as I stand behind the pulpit, I get this sense of the tangible presence of God. I don't know how to explain it. It was like a electric current maybe, or a little feeling, tremblies, God bumps I call them now. And Pastor Dean, he goes, "Hey," he wasn't Scottish, he was British. He says, "Do you know who the first preacher was to preach in that pulpit? Duncan Campbell of the Hebrides Revival." Wow. I barely left that pulpit. I was just wanted to soak up what I could, but I remembered that Duncan Campbell said it wasn't him. It wasn't him that brought revival. God was already working there. God was already on the move. God had already gripped the people on the Hebrides before he got there. He says, not me. And he said, but obedience and holiness and love for Christ all played a part. And Mr. Campbell preached as God would have him preach, and his legacy continues to this day, still bearing fruit. A few years later, I'd flown to Scotland by myself to seek the Lord about revival. I was there for a week. I had climbed a little mountain, not huge in Scotland, but climbed a little mountain, and I was sitting on a mountainside overlooking Loch Lomond, and I prayed. I said, what is it, Lord? What is it that you would pour out your Spirit on this particular land so much? I mean, there had been 7 huge revivals, significant revivals in the last couple of 100 years, even in the place that I was overlooking. And I was like, what is it about this people? What is it about this land that you would send your Spirit in such a way? And I got the sense that it was just desperate prayer. Desperate, fervent prayer. God, could you do that? Could you do that over here? So much so that bars close and dance halls close and crime goes down. I mean, could you do that here? And then I started thinking, what about in me? Could you put a seed in me, Lord? Could you put a seed in me and do in me what you did in them back then, so I can do now what you did through them back then? And I didn't feel anything really particular. I didn't think anything happened, but it did. And it is still resonating in me today. Now, since those days, my definitions of revival, they've changed. God has changed up much in my journey, but I still want to see authentic revival, move of His Spirit sweep across this land in my day and in my time, in our generation. God can be His own publicist. Let's just not be His instructors, but rather His obedient servants to get in on what He's doing, just the way Duncan Campbell, reluctantly, but he did. He did it. And he lived to see the wonders of God.